My secret, just do something that ain't nobody ever done before, but make it sound like something that's always been there forever.
Hello, welcome to This Filipino American Life, a podcast that explores the nuanced experiences of Filipinos in the United States at iba pa. My name is Joe Bernardo, and I'm joined by my fellow hosts.
Ryan Carpio.
Elaine Dolores. And
Mike.
Producer Mike.
Nice.
Yeah.
And we have here again in the studio, Miss Girly Collado.
I would like a lot more flair next time you announce me, Bernardo.
Oh, how about this? And now, brought to you by Berlado Studios, Joe's boss,
Girly Collado.
Yay.
I like that one better.
I like the first one better.
Hey, girly.
Hi, girly.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing?
All right, it's hot.
It's hot.
It's
hot
getting
here in the
hot
valley.
in here. So take. Yeah.
I'm fine. I have my pie.
This global warming
I know.
is so much warmer here. I don't get it. The valley.
Yeah, there's a lot of changes going on because of global warming.
Oh, is there?
Yeah. And speaking of changes, we're going to talk about lots of change.
Segue.
Oh, you know what? Before we talk about that,
Yeah.
Who's our TFAL of the episode?
The
Elaine?
TFAL of the episode is Bobby Mamaril.
Oh,
Bobby.
Do you know him?
Bobby. Well, no.
Sweet.
Do we? Yeah.
Do you?
Ba 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 ba
Ba- ba-
Mario.
Bobby. You know
No,
Bobby?
I don't know Bobby.
Oh, maybe I
I
don't.
don't know,
either.
but I knew.
Hey, Bobby. It's
Hi,
Ryan.
Bobby. I hope you might be related to Edsel Mamaril because I went to elementary school and high school with him.
There you go.
So maybe, who knows? But thank you, Bobby, for being our T-Pal.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I was like, waiting for horns.
Sorry.
Because you're on your
There you
phone.
go.
I was like, okay. Yeah, I thought you were going to
No.
bring out the horns.
Get on it, Elaine.
She's
Sorry.
ordering Postmates.
But as I was saying, we're going to talk about changes and
Changes?
losses.
Losses.
Yeah, things that we lose in our lives.
Oh, man. This is going to be sad.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Sorry, that was super loud.
I did not expect that.
I didn't either. I just lost my hearing.
This is my 8th grade graduation song.
Was it really?
Yeah, same too, actually.
Yeah.
They made us stand.
Me
Yeah, we were holding hands and they played the song at our 8th grade graduation.
you just swayed with the music? Like for a while?
Basically.
Oh my goodness. This is Joe.
Well, anyway, sorry. Sorry for the loud jump.
Oh my god.
It's amazing.
But I was going to think about a topic to talk about. And me and Girly were in the Philippines and we visited. Are you falling asleep, Ryan?
No. I had to do something with my headphone.
Okay, sorry. Well, anyways, we were in the Philippines and we went to my mom's hometown, Binakayan, Cavite. And we just noticed like there were so many changes in there in kind of my mom's hometown. And one of the biggest changes was a lot of our kind of ancestral homes, the homes where a lot of my aunts and uncles and stuff had. They're kind of falling in disarray because a lot of their offspring have moved abroad. Mm-hmm. They're either in like Australia, here in America, Europe, elsewhere. But there are not a lot of people in the hometown anymore to take care of the house. And I was just thinking about like things that we lose because of whatever, because of modernity, because of moving to the U.S., because of our adoption of modern values, modernization. What cultural value or cultural practices do we lose in the process as we kind of go through our lives? And so I wanted to pose that question to you all to kind of ask, what things have you lost in your lifetime that maybe you wish we didn't lose?
Well, I don't monopole anymore because like the people who I would monopole, they're gone. Because in my family, we would only do that to my grandparents. And so when my Lolo passed away, there was like no one to do that to bless, to do that motion. And I remember when my cousin Jim Boy moved from the Philippines to the States, he would do that to everyone, to like my mom and dad, to all the aunts and uncles, and my relatives all freaked out, like, no, you don't do that to me, you only do that to Lolo. Like that was the lesson. But guess because he was growing up, he did it to everyone, like that was the cultural practice. But now that like we're older, like there's nobody to do it to, and I don't even know if like the grandkids, like, or like my niece and nephew, if Mikey and Isi do that. I don't think they do.
Have you ever
Well,
been? Oh, go ahead.
I kind of picked up on one thing in particular that you just said, that practice was reserved for your elders.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, if your parents and your aunts and uncles resisted that action, then it kind of makes sense that the children would have no idea what it is. I personally didn't have any, like, I was born in the Philippines, and I personally did not have any clue what the heck that was until my family went back when I was 10, and I was made to do that, and I had no idea what they were doing with my hand. Like, you know, somebody took my hand and put it to my aunt's head, and I was like, I don't even know what that was. Like, I had no context.
Pagmamano.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, has anyone ever done it to you, like a younger Filipino person?
Yeah.
How did you feel?
I felt weird.
Did you know what you were supposed to do?
I was just like, thanks. Also, I'm not old enough to do this. Please stop doing that.
Yeah, what's the line for that? Because I mean, in my family, you know, most of my grandparents, they didn't like doing that. So whenever I did it, was like other people's grandparents.
Yeah.
It was like relatives basically, but it was like, you know, my own grandparents weren't all about that. You know, they never reinforced that or asked for that in any way.
Maybe we should make all the children in our lives do that to us now.
But I mean, what is the historical context of even that action?
Yes.
Does anyone know?
Please do tell us, Dr.
Historian.
Bernardo.
Well, it's actually a pre-colonial practice because people, our cousins in Indonesia do it, and it's called salim. But yeah, it's basically you put your elder's hand
On your
forehead, and it basically continued with Spanish colonization, but they changed the name to like pagmamano, like give me your hand, mano po.
Yeah.
But it's actually a pre-colonial kind of Southeast Asian practice.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in my family, I remember distinctly when my grandparents would walk through the door at a family party, like you would just hear all the titas go, like to yell at all the children, like, Lola are here.
Oh, you
Come
bless,
here,
you bless.
And I was like, ugh, okay, fine. Like we had to stop whatever we were doing in the party and line up to bless them.
Yeah.
And we would be in trouble if we didn't. So that was just, but now there's no Lolo and Lola. So like,
But essentially, it's supposed to be your parents now.
yeah. And
Right.
essentially all of them are vain and don't want to acknowledge that they are old. So no one does it to them.
Well, do you think that's actually because you're an American now, and it's more, there's more pressure to be younger?
Maybe. It could be just like an adopted, like they feel like what I felt when a kid did it to me in my early 30s. I was like, no, I'm not supposed to have this yet.
Yeah.
Like there was no acceptance yet that they were of the age
Right.
to be blessed.
I mean, is that maybe interrelated to like the idea when you call like someone older, like ate, tita, lola, who is not like necessarily part of your family, but like, you know, as a honorific or something? I don't know. Because
I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah.
I think it's
'Cause,
a respect thing, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, like, growing up, even in the schools, you were taught like these cultural things in class, like how you're supposed to respect. I remember having like textbooks on how to pass through people talking, like your elders. How you're supposed to kind of like bow and walk through if you need to pass in between them, or how you would manopo after church or something like that, right? I see a lot of older Filipinos now who actually do it to priests, even though the priest is younger.
I've
like, they
seen
would-
that. Yeah.
So I think originally for me, that's why I was so resistant to the action, because I associated it more to the church. And like I had more knowledge about the tension between the church and indigenous groups in the Philippines. So I was like, no, screw this. I'm not going to go Monopole. Because I was thinking like, oh, it's the indigenous people going up to priests and saying like, please bless me versus like doing it with your elders. Like I had no idea.
The elders, after you do that, they do say a God bless you kind of blessing usually. Right? They will say, oh, God bless you to whoever mana. But me growing up, we never greeted that way, depending on which side of the family. There's some sides of the family that's still very traditional, and there's families that were not so. Us, we hug and kiss, and then on another side of our family, it's like you can just tell they're like, I probably need to get mana po to this person or mana this person or that person.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing about the action for me is like it feels like you were honoring someone, but you're still keeping yourself at a distance to them. Yeah. So for me, like the hugging and the like, that feels more intimate. And for me, like I prefer that more than I do the whole Monopole actions. Yeah. So I don't make any of my nieces and nephews do any of that.
Yeah. I don't know. I like that. I like the idea of keeping that tradition. Yeah. Just because it's, I think, a reminder of respecting your elders.
Do you still do it?
Well, sometimes after church or something. Yeah. I'll do it to Girlie's parents after church. Yeah. I think they're weirded out by it.
Because they've never expected any of my brothers and I to do it. So it's probably why Joseph is their favorite.
Ooh,
I'm
good
totally
job.
their favorite. Okay, so besides that, any other kind of traditions? You brought up, Mike, the idea of kuya ate or tito tita. Has that tradition continued on in your family?
Well, I mean, we never even called my grandparents Lola or Lolo. Like,
oh, really?
I mean, I wonder if that's a regional
by the
thing
first
or
name.
like,
You took by the first name.
No, we said like literally we said grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle. Oh, okay. We never said tito or tita. So when I started meeting Filipinos who used those terms, I was like, what does that even mean? Like, I was completely unfamiliar with them. And so I don't know if that's like a local to where I'm from, or because of the fact that we didn't have a lot of family.
Navy thing.
I don't know, but I mean, like, so when I started encountering other Filipinos who use those words, it just felt so different. Like, is that a tradition from other Filipino families to kind of use specific like the Filipino honorifics versus just like American ones?
Well, I know for me, I only use tita and tito, ate, and only ate. No one was kuya really, but I could only say that to you if like you were my actual relative, like blood family, and then everybody else was like auntie so and so. So like that was in my brain how my parents were able to distinguish like all these Filipinos. And I always thought like, oh, I guess that's just how it works, right? Like I would never call Ryan like Kuya Ryan or anything because I'm like, Ryan is not my family, like by blood. But like, and people would, I would always say though, like if we were cousins, I'm like, yeah, we're cousins, right? Like, but there was this one time somebody who I grew up calling a cousin, like we were introducing each other like randomly at a restaurant, and I was introducing this person to my group of friends, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is my cousin so and so, and then she was like, we're not really cousins, and I was like taken aback, like, but I grew up with you and like we're Filipino. I can't believe you just did that. And then luckily my group of friends is all Filipino, so they got it. But like she was with like her white boyfriend at the time, so I was just like, I don't know what you were doing, but that was weird.
No, yeah, like I mean, I thought about this like in even like the professional setting, like when there's like older Filipinos in the office, do I call them like ate?
I refuse.
Yeah.
You refuse?
I refuse.
Why?
Girlie refuses a lot of things.
I actually do. I when there's a Filipino elder in like my office, I do call them tita.
Do you ask them first though? Like,
you know what? I don't.
You just call them
which
tita?
is kind of weird.
Because I think I did that once, and I think she might have like the person I'm thinking about like might have been like no.
Offended. Yeah, like not don't even.
So do you do that to strangers when you see Filipinos randomly? Because I know in the Philippines, I tended to do that
because they do that.
Yeah, because they do that. But do you ever do that here?
No, not to strangers.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So like. People have called me that, like other Filipinos have called me like kuya, as like a stranger. But yeah, in my family I have a kuya and an ate. Even though I have two older brothers, I don't call them kuya. Although I used to, but I lost that. I love it. And but there's also hierarchies of
Right.
Yeah.
And
I
for
don't
me,
really-
like I had a new colleague start recently who happens to be Filipino, and she referred to me as ate at some point. I was like, don't call me that.
Yeah.
Well,
And
also
I think-
you're Ilocano though, and it's not an
Well,
Ilocano thing.
I know, but I've kind of let go of that a
Yeah.
little bit.
Because they
but-
say manong and
They say
manang.
manong
right?
and-
Exactly.
manang.
But ultimately, for me, it feels like it creates some sort of hierarchy. And I don't know, in a work setting, and also like, I just don't
You didn't
want
feel
to
comfortable.
create those hierarchies.
Yeah.
Because they should not exist in the way that we interact
Professionally.
the way that I interact with my colleagues. So I resist doing it.
Now I'm looking back at like maybe I shouldn't have done that. But like there's folks that like Tita Susana, I would call her Tita Susana.
Oh yeah.
I do it in a way that like that's the way to play the game and to get what I need and what I want done.
So it's transactional for you.
Well, kind of. Well, because like,
Well, like when you're at like Seafood City or like Hope You Like It.
nah, fuck that place. But,
No, you're like, excuse
I was
me,
like,
Tita.
Screw you, Tita. Do not cut in line. I will cut you. But like when I used to work in a corporate setting, there was a Tita that knew I was Filipino, and I knew she was Filipino because she had a tin of Skyflakes at her desk. And I remember once I was like super dying and hungry, and she kind of like saw that I was weak or something, and she was just like, "Oh, here," and she like opened up her Skyflakes tin and handed me a Skyflakes, and I was just
And a
like,
sewing
Sewing
kit.
Here's your Skyflakes.
like,
Here's your thimble.
"Oh, thank you." And I remember I said, "Thanks, Ate." And I said Ate, not Tita, because I was like, if I say Tita and she doesn't want to feel old, I will insult her. But if I say Ate and technically she's old, but it doesn't matter, it's a compliment.
Yeah.
So I always do Ate, even if the folks are like older and I would call them Tita, I would just say Ate because it makes them feel young and a compliment.
I mean, so thinking about your question, Joe, like in terms of things, traditions or practices that are lost, I mean, for me, I think I hesitate to use the word tradition because tradition to me is not static. And oftentimes I feel like people use that word to refer to practices that have been around for a very long time. And I think that there's always opportunities for practices to adjust to what we like our present day realities, right? But then there are also like, so I try not to use the word tradition when I mean something else. But when I think about practices, like, the practice of saying kuya, ate, or manong manang, other things that come to mind for me are like our weaving practices. When we were in the Philippines, I mean, I guess generally fabric art or weaving practices around the world have always been a really huge interest of mine because it just feels like a practice that is very intrinsic in like it's a necessity in a lot of indigenous groups to have something for clothing, something to cover our families and whatnot. And so I was very intentional about learning more about that when we were recently in the Philippines. And so I took advantage of the fact that we were doing this road trip along the coast and into the Ilocos region because apparently weaving practices in the Ilocos region tend to be stronger economically than they are in the southern part of the country because the technology has always the technology exists. There's a strong like community of weavers, and just like you'll see in Latin America and Africa, the patterns are specific to different areas of the country, and then the other so there are all these you'll also find a lot more social entrepreneurship types of businesses that have come up over the past couple of years that are working with these weaving communities to make sure that these practices don't die. Because you'll also find that a lot of these weaving communities, many of the people who practice them are much older, like in their 80s. So it's great to know that there is intentionality about making sure that that knowledge and those practices are getting passed down to generations, not just women but also men. And I, so there's like these NGOs that have also popped up with regards to that. So it's just really interesting to see. It's not just they're not just blankets anymore that people are making, but they're thinking about them like, again, like what is the economic argument? What is the economic benefit to these practices, and how, like, how far can you push?
So you're
this
talking
practice?
about Inabel.
I am.
So you're talking about a weaving practice from the locals called Inabel.
Yes.
Okay. And
but
so
in Tagalog,
are you saying it's dying?
I think for a while it was. I mean, that's why. Oftentimes the majority of the people who still practice it and who know most of the way to do these things are older.
Well, we talk about like all these different kind of like, for example, like Wang Od, right? She's the last tattoo artist, right? And then Girly was talking about Inabel, which is like this weaving practice that's occurring in the Philippines. And then, there's all these things about like language and how like Filipino Americans are kind of losing their language, and there's kind of is language dying? Is Tagalog even dying in the Philippines because so many people do speak English? And so I guess my question and kind of the reason for this topic is change inevitable, and why do we preserve the things that we want to preserve?
That's a really good question.
I like the thing that Girly said, like tradition isn't static. Like it shouldn't be static. Just because I think when you get locked into like things being a certain way, it stifles innovation or creativity. And so I don't know, like in terms of weaving practices and like cultural practices like that, like I'd be saddened if those things went away. I would like to hope that like the younger folks would take it up and then like innovate with it. Like if the weaving turned, like I've seen some things where like with Vincent, that one company where they make modern designs of Filipino clothing.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, because wasn't there an article recently about kind of the proper way to honor kind of like some of these historical kind of like styles and weavings and patterns and stuff, like, and there's a whole debate about, is there a right way to kind of like repurpose something that was created for a specific purpose?
Yeah. But purpose in what?
So it was like a fashion spread, and someone was like taking these traditional like weavings and patterns and turning them into like modern style dresses and stuff.
Okay.
And there was a whole article about like, this is the right way versus the wrong way, and then like there was a whole debate on top of that.
But who gets to say what's right and wrong?
Exactly.
Because if you even think about how the form of dress in the Philippines evolved, like, I mean, come on. It's had so much influence from the Spanish and all the different colonizers in the country. Like if you look at the history, like it just continues to change. And there was actually one statement that Vincent put on their blog maybe about a month ago, saying how the Maria Clara was very much like identified with Imelda Marcos, and when she left the country, I guess the practice of wearing that dress every day stopped. I think that's what she had posted. And so the reason why she's doing what she does is because she's reclaiming that dress, that style of dress, because it's still very much identified with being Filipino, but taking it out of the context of Imelda Marcos.
Interesting.
So, I mean, I think economics has a lot to do with it, Joey, in terms of how you choose what practice exists. Because, again, I'm going to go back to the weaving communities. Like, they've been doing these practices for a very long time, not necessarily for economic reasons, but now there's a different level of economic opportunity for them. Like they're getting out into the international market potentially because people are seeing these weavings as like bath towels, as like beach mats, as humongous blankets. But the thing to think about is because their technology is still very much 1.0.
Yeah, but if you're talking about like an economic argument for these things, like in the economic system of capitalism, there are winners and losers, and things change according to who the winners are, right? We are in America because we're economically forced out of the Philippines to become an America, and in order to economically survive, you have to not speak Tagalog. You have to speak English.
And I was gonna say like,
right? And so like, I guess my thing is like, is that the change?
Right.
Yeah. Is it that kind of change? Is it good? Is it not? To lose these things, right? So like,
And you bring up something about economics, like you could just think of all the businesses that we've lost because of economics, because there wasn't enough people to sustain them. I mean, we talk about Tatak Filipino all the time, saying
sponsor us,
Tatak Filipino.
If folks who don't know what Tatak Filipino is, it was a store that had like a lot of Filipino handicrafts. They had their flagship store here in LA, but they had also branches in the Bay Area, San Diego, and New Jersey.
Know that either.
I just knew that of the Tatak Filipino, it was on Hillhurst in the Los Feliz area, and it was a marker for me being in LA. Like Tatak Filipino was like, oh, that's the store to go to, and like, it disappeared in the recession era or something. Like
even before that,
in the 90s, right?
Yeah,
like
before that.
early 2000s.
Early 2000s. Okay, and so
because
like
a lot of that stuff ended up at SIPA, so they closed down.
Oh, okay. There you go. But I mean, so like that was a business, and like I think of other things like Mike and I I frequent a strip mall on Sunset and Fountain, which is across the street from Mamser all the time. And that strip mall housed Mommy King. And as a kid, I used to go to that Mommy King all the time. It was the Mommy King to go to. It's the first place I ever ate balut. It's the first place I choked on balut and stopped eating balut for a very long time. And it disappeared because Mommy King, all of a sudden, like people weren't going, or there was like some issue with the restaurant's family ownership, which a lot of times it can happen. And so it disappeared. And so I always think like that if I find it interesting that like 20 years later, I still go to this strip mall, but like the Filipino cultural parts of it are all gone. Like Mommy King is gone. And you just think like in Seattle where Musang is opening, right? Like Inai's was one of those restaurants in Beacon Hill, and it disappeared, and like that was an economic thing, right? Like, because like it just you want to see these things last, but like nothing can really last forever in like in the capitalist. So this is getting very dark.
But, I
think it's just economics is just one argument, because again, like I go back to the fact that the practice of weaving has existed for so many centuries. I don't think that will die. But I mean, I think we need to be like the act of doing it. But I don't know what the patterns will look like centuries from now.
Well, I think like, the thing I've been trying to get back to is like the ebb and flow of culture, right? So like when my parents came here, all that stuff you were talking about, like weaving and textiles, like I hadn't known anything about it, like really until only more recently, because my mom started kind of talking really big about the textiles from their part of the country. It's like, oh, the Miagao Hablon and all this other stuff. And look at this dress and look at all these things. And like now it's becoming big on the international stage. Like, but she never talked about that when I was growing up. And she didn't have any of those things with her when she came to America. And it's like, I think in the process of coming to America, there was all these things that was intrinsic to what her cultural kind of like upbringing was, that she only took parts of with her, right? And she only passed on parts of those on to like us. And it's only kind of like because of the ebbs and flows of culture that like the thing that she might have like thought was like annoying as a kid or didn't really think too much about, now that it became kind of gaining a certain amount of prominence in like the culture again, at least with her like friends and relatives and things like that. She's talking about it again. It's like, oh yeah, when I was growing up, I would wear like this dress or whatever else. So it's like like alongside like capitalism and kind of like economics and stuff, but just like culturally, you know, especially when you think about kind of the eras of the Philippines and the eras of like Filipino American and other migration, the things that we hold on to as traditions that we identify as markers of our culture will always shift, and it might come back and forth to the things that happened decades ago. But that doesn't make them any less important or prominent. It's just the fact that like these are the things that we kind of see as touchstones, and why like a store like Tatak might have like, you know, been like really big in the 90s when like there was a lot of kind of like resurgence around kind of understanding Filipino identity and like wanting to kind of purchase those things. There's no internet to buy that stuff, you know, and then as the internet started gaining prominence, and it was harder to kind of set up businesses in America. And the other thing I think about, when you're talking about like Mommy King, like all the Filipino restaurants and all this whole Filipino food explosion thing happening is all newer restaurants. There's some touching on tradition, but a lot of like acknowledging of kind of like the transference of like migration and how that affects the way our palates kind of perceive food, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say there's like a super traditional Filipino restaurant that's opening up that's super successful.
Yeah.
That's the ebbs of flows in culture. And like at some point or another, but at some point or another, maybe those restaurants will start coming like back to the roots of like Filipino food and like pure, like this is just like exactly how the indigenous people would make it. You know what I mean? Like who knows if that might be the next thing in like a decade, right?
Yeah.
And so
you're saying maybe the essence of it still is there, but maybe like the surface of it, or maybe its expression changes.
I think it's the things that we value as markers of our culture. Like what if like somewhere down the line was like, let's take your kids to Monopole. Like why not? You know, because let's say I remember doing that as a kid, and like even though my parents stopped doing that, maybe I'll be the one to bring it back, or my kids will bring it back. Or,
go. I was gonna say, okay, let me back up a little bit. So I think our desire to have things last, whether it's Monopole, calling someone kuya, it's really what you were saying about the essence and the meaning behind it, right? So these are reminders for us. So there are some older generation Filipinos who will criticize me. I'll use personal stories. Can criticize me as a younger person who says, "Oh, you don't do this anymore. You don't Monopole anymore," and they see that as a sign of maybe disrespect, right? You don't respect the old way we do things any longer, and of course our progressive and our younger argument's always been, oh, we show it in other ways, right? So I think in essence, what tradition has is like this idea that we don't want to lose whatever it is we don't want to lose, whether it be the practice of weaving because it allowed people to be productive about something that they needed anyway, right? The way we cook, the traditional recipes of the way we cook is because if you have the recipes that gets passed on, you know that it tastes good, and et cetera, et cetera. The reason we Monopole is because we want to make sure that our kids don't grow up to be assholes, right? And forget about their elders, and make sure that these kids know that they should respect their elders. So there's always meaning behind it, right?
Right.
And the thing that's always going to change is change. Right, things are. It is. I mean, recipes are going to change. People's interpretations are going to change. Interpretations of Monopole is going to change. But
food definitely has changed.
Food is definitely changed.
And it's also like if you don't Monopole, but what if you just hug and kiss your parents?
And that's the thing is like for us, I just grew up not doing that. So the way we show our respect for our parents is like after church, you go give them a kiss. You know, like, and that's what you do instead of like the Monopole. So going back to like me calling someone tita, my intention was never to make them feel old. My intention has always been to
be
say,
respectful.
I acknowledge that you are of the same kind of cultural background. Yeah. I want to show you that I respect you. And by all means, I'm supposed to show you this respect different from the way I show respect to anybody else. I would never call unfortunately, like a white person like Tito or Tita. Yeah. Because I won't. No. I have a very different respect.
It's a different cultural
respect
competence.
for someone.
Yeah.
Right. It's just an understanding differently from someone. And so I'm okay with that. Will that change? I'm with you, Joe. I hope not. I hope that the acknowledgement of those things don't. I hope that language doesn't leave us. Yeah. The way our,
But, I mean, I could kind of go both ways. I also think that, like what Mike said, there are certain cultural practices that may look on the surface has changed, but in its essence, it's still kind of it operates the same way. Like for example, Catholicism, right?
Yeah.
People make a big deal. We were colonized and we were forced into Catholicism, which in many ways it's true, but like the way Filipinos have practiced Catholicism, it's a very local practice, right? Which kind of is indicative of the indigenous practices that has sustained through Catholicism. For example, like saints, the veneration of saints. You can see that it's a pre-colonial practice of worship of anitos, which is like a medium. Anyways, I'm going into the weeds too much. But Catholicism, like even like Tagalog or Taglish, there are grammatical rules within Taglish that still keeps Tagalog intact, right? And if you look at Tagalog as a language, there are a lot of loan words, right? But it has been domesticated, has been localized to be kind of uniquely Filipino. So yeah, I think there is a sense of the core of a traditional practice will still remain the same, right. But the kind of outward may be influenced by the outside.
Right. Yeah. And I also I've had this thought, I'm just kind of like mulling it over in my head that like, for a lot of us, well, I'm not gonna say for a lot of us, I don't generalize, but like personally for me, I think in my own family's practice, they were so focused on surviving and making it through and like just adjusting to living here that I think they gave us the cultural things that they could. And like there's a luxury in being able to do your cultural practices that being in this country, not everybody is afforded that.
Right.
Right? Like I'm just like trying to process it. Like Mike's mom is really into like talking about hablon and all these things now. Like every time she goes back, she brings it. But for like 20 years, she didn't do that
because probably in survival
because she was in survival mode and just trying to make it in Oxnard, and so like the level of what we got to do as our Filipino identity is intrinsically tied to like our transnational privilege and class.
Yeah,
like
totally.
my parents, we were middle class and we were lower middle class, but they were able to be like to give me like the ability to call my ate kari ate or my tita tito and tito and all that stuff. And then like I had the luxury of going to a Filipino market and growing up with a Filipino market for a very long time. And I know that there are people out there who don't have that, right? Like they don't even have an Asian market. But my parents can still remember, they're like, oh, when we first got here, there was no Filipino market. We had to go to a Thai market instead, right? They can hold on to the scarcity, like that's still in their mind. And like us now, we are in this space of like, it's not necessarily like a scarcity model. Like we have everything at our fingertips, thank you to the internet, right? Like I could buy rice, I could buy fish sauce, I can buy mongo.
You can probably buy Tatak Filipino stuff.
I could probably buy, yeah, I mean, sure. All those books. It may cost an arm and a leg shipping wise because it might be coming from the Philippines, but I can still have access to it. And I think that's a luxury and a privilege of us now.
Yeah.
But that's also where the intersection of market forces come in too, right? Like
Right.
accessibility is tied to the fact that there's a demand and a willingness on our part at this point in our generation that we're more outwardly kind of celebrating and kind of identifying with some of those cultural markers, things that may or may not have been like either afterthoughts or not even passed on to us. But even when you think about like a PCN and kind of all these other things that are reclamations of kind of like this idea of what identity is, it's kind of trying to raise traditions in which we may not have been raised in, but feel like it's connected to our identity in a way that nobody else can be connected to it, right? And so I think in the overall kind of human desire to want to kind of identify kind of, where you're at and where you've come from and things like that. We've drawn from different parts of that identity in different ways. And so whatever it is now, whether it be food or whether it be lifestyle clothing, whether it be anything, things don't die out forever. And I mean, like even like Wang Od and the whole tattoo thing, like, she's been around for like, well, her entire life, obviously. Yeah. But I mean, like, it's not like she disappeared and kind of reappeared all of a sudden. It's just because there was like some kind of point at which like that cultural relevance was kind of raised beyond kind of the borders of their community and kind of highlighted in a way that, for good or bad, I mean, it's just like,
the good thing is we are aware of her and we are aware of her cultural practice. And yes, she is the last of her generation, but then she's training her nieces to continue to continue that tradition and whatnot.
Real
But-
quick, how do we determine what gets preserved?
I was gonna say we get to pick and choose, actually, right?
Yeah.
we have that luxury to pick and choose what we decide to preserve. Or maybe talking about our parents, for example, they got to leave the Philippines. They can leave. Actually, when they came here, they could have left whatever they wanted to leave there.
Yeah.
Cultural practice, family, anger, whatever. Start anew, right? There's
Yeah.
this whole idea of being able to pick and choose what we try to bring over here. So that is actually an interesting luxury that we have as Filipino Americans, I think, to be able to say we want to keep the traditions of respecting your elders. We want to keep the traditions of making sure that you attend family dinner
I
or
don't
go to
think
church.
that's limited to America, though.
I
I
don't
think
think so
each
either.
generation gets to pick and choose
Right.
what they preserve.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to continue my tradition of singing Tagalog songs wrong or something.
But what's cool is we actually get to start other traditions, and I'm a big believer that I want the future generations to be smarter than me and better off than me, and I that's just I think how it should work. I think we should leave the world in a better place, and I feel like if we're not progressing, then we're doing something wrong. That progressing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean that you're trying to lose something on purpose. But I think the idea is to be able to continue something on that does preserve the essence of what you want to do.
Yeah.
Thanksgiving dinner, never did that in the Philippines. Every day is Thanksgiving if you have food on the table for us in the Philippines, right? But here at Thanksgiving, to have something that has a turkey, you know what? We're going to add our own traditions to it. We're not going to have turkey. We're going to have seafood and lobster and and ham and stuff like that. So I think it's actually really cool that we get a chance to do that.
It's like an evolution of
Yeah.
what our traditions can be. Like
Right.
how haranas have turned into love songs and pop songs.
Slow jams.
Slow jams.
Right.
And like these conversations, I mean, I'm pretty sure cavemen sitting around the fire were talking to each
Yeah.
other about the fire and how hot it was.
And 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to do necessarily this.
Yeah.
This idea of talking about this and broadcasting it in the airwaves.
It reminds me of I don't know. I read Freud in grad school, and they were talking about mourning and melancholy. So like mourning is basically like
Not
a
night?
loss. Mourning is basically you're
MOU.
contemplating a loss, right? But it gets you recover from it once it gets replaced by something, right? So by something new, like a new tradition, for lack of a better example. But melancholy is something where there's nothing to replace it, so you have constant kind of you're in constant
Sadness.
state of mourning.
Yeah.
And David Eng talked about racial melancholia, basically saying how people who have been oppressed continue to have this idea of mourning because white supremacy is continuing to creating that
Traumatic.
I was like, why would you read Freud as a historian? But then you brought that part in, and now it makes sense.
Thank you.
But that's what we don't necessarily want the meloncholly, right? We
Yeah,
want-
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You can mourn the loss, but then
Yeah.
be thankful for the fact that you can bring on a new tradition.
And hopefully you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mourn the loss that we have to end this conversation,
Yeah.
but I am thankful that we've had it today.
And I am in constant melancholia because I don't have my 1995 Honda Civic anymore.
Wait, what? It's
Oh,
gone?
God.
What'd you do with it?
Whoa.
No,
Wait.
it's not dead.
Where'd it
It's-
go?
It's
Oh.
actually taken on another life.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
My cousin took it and is fixing it up right now.
Wait, the silver one or the white one?
The white one.
Do you still have the silver one?
Yeah, it's my dad's, but
Okay.
that wasn't the one that
The
I
white
felt
one.
very
Yes.
attached to. It was the white one.
Oh,
Yeah.
R.I.P. I mean, not R.I.P., but yay, your cousin's fixing it up.
Yay, it's not sitting in our driveway.
For those who don't know, Joe had that 1995 Civic for a long time, and I associate that car with Joe.
It really does need to be in a Honda museum.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's probably close to 300,000 miles by now.
Wow.
I mean, I used to recognize that it was your car because of that hanging flag that you have put on your new car, but still.
So thank goodness we have a new car that Joe can
New tradition.
Yeah, new traditions. I'm no longer in the morning.
Right. You're just in payment.
Yeah.
Car payment.
Car payment.
Is there a tradition, TFAL listeners, that you or cultural practice that you no longer do that you want to talk about? Let us know. 805-394-TFAL. Ryan, what's that number?
805-394-TFAL.
Yeah. Or you can email us thisfilipinoamericanlife@gmail.com. This Filipino American Life is produced by Michael Nailat. Our intro and outro music is by Roger Habon, aka 10.4 Raj. Resident reality checker Girly Colado, legal advisor Rianne Fajardo, and graphic design by Vincent Collyer.